Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming today. So this is the Got a Family Secret, Can You Keep It talk. I know researching family history is one of the most popular pastimes in the UK, and in this presentation we're going to look at just some of the resources that can be used to help you uncover your family secrets, and just as importantly, put leaves on the tree, which people often neglect a little bit. And a little adage is often said, once you start researching family history, you can't stop, but perhaps a better adage, you don't want to stop, because it can be really, really fascinating. So we'll start off with perhaps the most basic thing, the parish registers. These were formally introduced in England and Wales on the 5th September 1538 as part of the Protestant Reformation, and shortly after Henry VIII's formal split with Rome. From that date, parish priests were required to keep registers of all persons baptised, married and buried in their parish. And these are just some of the covers, some of the earlier ones we have. The early registers generally contain only basic details, and certainly the pre-1754 registers typically contain baptisms, marriages and burials all in one volume, as this example from Down Hatherley shows. But they can be on separate pages, they can be reversed, they can be upside down or mixed up throughout the whole book. So the earlier registers are not the best things to try and search. However, so on other occasions, the vicars pursued other options, and here the Vicar of Old Sodbury decided to record events in columns, which is very good of him, makes it a lot easier to look through than trying to fight through sort of the page on the right, as you can imagine. So the baptisms, the earlier register entries, often in Latin. This is an entry for Down Hatherley, has a mix. If you look there, you can see that the male children are noted as son, S-O-N-E, but females are listed as filia. Earlier on in that same register, it's all in English, apart from the title. You can see it's Baptismus, and it's got the year Anno Domini. So there was no hard or fixed rules at this time. And we know that, like everybody, on occasion, vicars made mistakes. This is an interesting entry from the Down Amni Crucis register, where the margin alongside the entry, the vicars put star for John Reed Robert. So obviously you've got it completely wrong. I'm certainly glad I didn't get that on my son's baptism, as I'd have been in the doghouse for years. Children were typically baptised quite soon after birth, usually within 2 weeks, but not always. There are some later, some longer. And occasionally when you're looking through the sort of parish registers, you'll get multiple baptisms, not necessarily indicating children born on the same day, but it could be different ages. And typically these occurred among the watermen and their families, because they rarely stayed in any one place long enough for the local vicars to catch up with them. And this is a great example from the Mariners' Chapel in Gloucester, and it records just such a roundup. Here the vicars managed to baptise all the children of the Ash family and the Bailey family in December 1866. The former children were aged 1, 3, 6 and 10, while the latter children were 9, 12, 14 and 20. So they'd evaded the vicar for a long time. Some children, usually those who were sickly or weak and weren't expected to survive, were baptised very quickly within a day or two. And in the registers, you'll usually spot this. It says private baptism or privately baptised, as you can see here in this example. Out of the way. If they did survive, sometimes a second baptism entry can be found later in the same register, and it's usually welcomed into the church or admitted into the congregation. And here's a typical example. Interestingly, you don't always get this, but sometimes you do. So the parish registers very rarely give the birth dates. They're not interested in that. They're interested in the baptism dates. But there are exceptions. And this is a page from the Thornbury Parish Register for 1768 to 1812. And here the vicar's gone the other way. He's gone overboard. He's given lots of biographical notes. So as well as your basic details of the child's name, the baptism date, the name of the father and the mother, and the father's occupation, he's actually recorded the following: the number of the child in the family, the child's birth date, the mother's mother and father, plus the mother's father's occupation. So, who's really got overboard on this? And as I say, if all vicars had done this, I think family history would be a lot easier, but the books would be a lot bigger. Looking at bastardy, perhaps quite surprisingly, illegitimacy was actually never common, and the number of illegitimate births typically under 3% before the 1600s. It slowly increased to around 7% by the 1840s, when interestingly about a third of the women were actually pregnant at their marriage. But then it dropped down to about 4% in the 1890s, and then back to around 2% in sort of the early 20th century. Baptisms lit at children were usually recorded as base born, as at Lydney here, or base child, often abbreviated to BB here. Sometimes they have natural child off, or very quite simply bastard child off, and a lot of it depended on the vicar, how he felt about things, essentially. If he was more of a hellfire one, he's going to use bastard, that sort of language, rather than natural child or base born. So, you get bastardy bonds, which is quite interesting. So the deceived maiden, who a victim of the bounder's advances, would, if she couldn't support herself, or if her parents refused to support her, there's this great Victorian picture of the young mother being turfed out of the house by the father, the other daughters implying the father to keep her, and the son is had in his hands. She's being turfed out. So if she couldn't support herself, basically they became chargeable to the parish overseer of the poor, or after 1835, the Poor Law Unions. If identified, the cad or his parents would be served with a bastardy bond to pay for the mother's lying-in and subsequent maintenance of the child, basically indemnifying the parish against any future costs. After 1835, the boards of guardians would also happily pursue errant fathers, so they would try and get some money if they could. And this is an example of a bastardy bond. It's from the parish of Blockley, signed by James Mace, who was the putative father of Hannah Marshall's child. And Mace promised to pay the overseers the sum of £11, about 750 quid today, but only on the condition if the child to be born of the body of Hannah Marshall was born alive and that it was still alive after 2 years. So he's definitely hedging his bets here. This is a 1771 bond, relates to John Pavey of Minchinhampton for the child of Makepeace Brown. And Makepeace probably wasn't all she did by the sound of it. And in this instance, the bond was for £1 a week for 5 years. Comes to about £13, 11 shillings, which is around £1,200 today. So this is a sort of probably a more common one than the one before, I think. On occasion, vicars could be suspicious about things said by the child's parents, and this is from the parish of Lydney. It's the baptism of Edmund, son of Eleanor Jones and John Partridge, where the vicar was very suspicious of the couple and felt that they were pretending to be married as they could give no proof of it. Essentially, this would make the child a bastard if they could, but they've tried to get around this if they were not married. Coming to marriages, so marriage registers give different information depending on the date. Prior to 1754, typically you've got the name of the bride and the groom and the date of the marriage, that's it. Some registers give the name of the parish where they were from if it was different to the place of marriage, as at Cobbley, this one below, but you can see where Thomas Phipps and Mary Cook were actually from Dowdeswell. And occasionally these registers might give the name of the bride's father, but not always. And between 1754 to 1837, you get pro forma registers. These give the following: the name and parish of abode of bride and the groom, the date of the marriage, whether they were married by banns or by licence, the name of the minister, the signature or mark of the bride and groom, plus name and signature of witnesses. So again, these tend to be much easier to use and they're easier to find anyway. From 1837 onwards, you get much better information. You get the date and the place of marriage, the name, age, marital status, occupation and residence of the groom and of the bride, plus the occupations of their fathers. You then get whether they were married by banns or licence and the name of the minister, and you also get names and signatures of the bride and groom and witnesses. Very often, some of these, you'll note at the bottom one here, you'll see an X or a cross, and that's the mark of the person who obviously they couldn't read or write, so they just make their mark and then the vicar would fill the name in. Looking at banns and marriage licences, so these come in after Lord Hardwicke's Marriage Act of 1753, where marriages were formalised and had to occur in a church, and couples also had to have the banns of marriage published or a licence from the diocese. If neither of these were applied or foreordained, then the marriage would be void. So to get a license or an allegation, the couple had to allege before the bishop or a surrogate that there was no lawful barrier to the marriage. They could also be obtained on the day before a wedding, so they're quite popular for quick marriages for whatever reason. Anyone could apply for a license, but as a fee was charged, they were more common with the upper classes or the middle to upper classes. And the license allegation will provide usually the following information about the bride and groom. So the name, marital status, age, especially if they were underage, the occupation, where their marriage was to be held, and an oath of living in the parish for abode for 4 weeks. They're usually pro forma, as you can see here, with the vicar filling in the details or the bishop surrogate doing it, but very often they put extra information on there. So all that information is actually contained on the section there on the bottom half. The bans of marriage, so these were announcements of the intention to marry. To become official, they had to be read for 3 successive Sundays at the churches of the groom's parish, the bride's parish, and the church in which the couple intended to marry. And they generally contain a lot less information than the pro forma marriage registers. You get some oddballs. This is a nice one. Marriage didn't all go to plan. This is from 1732 at Horsley. It's a bit sort of hard to read, but it's John Peglin and Anne Thomas were half married on the August 7th. I proceeded no further because they paid me but one half of his 2 shillings and 6pence. So we don't quite know what's happened here. Obviously, couple haven't paid the right fee, so the vicar's only half married them. Presumably, you say, "Well, I'll continue the marriage and fully marriage you when you give me the rest of the cash." So it's an interesting one. Looking at burials, so the burials and the registers usually provide just basic information. The early registers usually give just the name and date of burial, that's it, nothing extra. Sometimes you do get other information, such as the spouse, the abode, age, condition, or occupation, but you move on to post 1813, the pro forma registers. They give a set amount of information: the name, abode, date of burial, age of the deceased, and the officiated minister. But in these volumes, sometimes extra information is given in the margins. Here's an example. This is a shocking, you'll see why in a minute, entry in the Dunstable and Rouse Parish Register. It records the burial of John Stone, the son of Walter Stone of Cirencester, 18th of April 1636. And usually this is when the vicars recorded how he died, as he was smitten to death in the thunder and lightning, and this was the handiwork of God. And to emphasise this, the vicar has drawn a manual on the left-hand side of the register there, pointing down, which is a great one. I love this entry. We often hear about plague outbreaks. Well, plague was pretty endemic everywhere, at least prior to the 1700s. And this register from North Nibley records an outbreak where over 10 people perished. They were nearly all buried in their gardens. This goes on over 2 pages. It's in the bottom of the one side. And it says, "Mine in this year, 1638, it pleased God to visit this parish with the plague, of which Henry Matthews, John his son, Mary his daughter, and Abigail, daughter of Nicholas Munday, whose names are above written, were all suspected to die, and those parties whose names are underwritten are all certainly known to die of the same." And again, the vicars here emphasise this with another manual there, the hand of God. This is where God's will. We're going to make these people die. This is we don't get too many of these, although we know plague was endemic. A sad feature of the Sevenside parishes is that bodies would often wash up on the river or shorelines, and prior to the 1808 Burial of Drowned Persons Act, it was usual to bury unclaimed bodies of those drowned at sea in unconsecrated ground where they came ashore, usually above the tide line, but without shrouds, coffins or markers. But the new act required that such bodies should be laid to rest in the nearest consecrated ground and paid for by the parish. Identification, of course, is very rarely possible, and here the vicar has recorded tattoos on the arm of a drowned man. So it's a man drowned and pitched up opposite the Wood End Marsh, September the 24th or 25th, thus marked on the left arm. And there he's got RP, AP, a heart and an anchor. So he's obviously a sailor. Presumably the surname was P. We just don't know, and presumably they never found out what happened to him. We also get an unusual case here. This is also in Orr. 1733 records an instance of body snatching when the vicars noted it. William Hughes was buried on December the 2nd, and underneath the vicars put NB. This body was stolen out of the grave the same night by Sam Steele, Thomas Salins, Rich Wiseman, and James Lane. Hasn't said why, or and there's no follow-up to this. So it would be really interesting to find out. I suspect he wasn't taken off to be given to the body to the surgeons to cut up. It's probably taken off and buried elsewhere, but we'll never know. We get some nice oddities in the parish registers. So there's just a couple here. This is Harefield register for 1675, records a Christmas earthquake. This year reigned a mortal fever in most parts of England. Also, there happened in these lower parts of Gloucestershire a great earthquake at Christmas. That's a nice one. No other registers note that earthquake. I've looked for it, but so it's interesting why just the Harefield vicar did. You've also got another. This is another one at Orr. It's a great parish, Orr. Lots of stuff goes on there. Here we noted after the burial of Mary Lodge on the 9th of January, this is the old style dating, there was a violent storm that broke open the seawalls, causing massive flooding to the levels of 5 foot for the local area. So that's quite a big breakthrough of this storm. So it must have been quite an interesting day. And then this is the vicar of Harefield Parish. Obviously, he's a budding artist, so he's actually doodled on the front cover on this lovely pictures, a few naked cherubs and things going on there, and then he's put who the church saw in 1599. So you do occasionally get some nice things. Has to be said that most of this stuff is in the earlier registers, not the later ones. Ooh. So let's go with the previous one. So again, mentioned vicars are human here. This is a great one. 1827, the vicar of Hatherett forgot to enter the baptism of Jane Scrivens for 8 months, and he didn't remember until December. So he must have been going through it and thought, blimey, I haven't done her from that date, so she is there. So sometimes this still tells you you've really got to be careful. You're looking for a baptism or a burial or a marriage in the register. You can't find them. Well, make sure you look fore and aft a little bit, because the vicar might have simply forgotten it and entered it later in there. So, you have to be careful of these things occasionally. You get some spin-offs. This is an interesting one. This is from the Cobbley Register. It records the death of Lucy, Countess of Down, 8th of April 1656. She died at Cobbley Manor House. She was aged 32 and was wife to Thomas Pope, the 2nd Earl of Down. She was just 14 when they married, and the marriage seems to have been a little bit hiccupy. He spent most of his time away. But interestingly, someone has entered in this after the register in a different hand. She fasted from eating or drinking before her death 10 days. And the local author Guy Shepherd has woven this into a Woman in Black style Gothic horror novel, which imagines the restless Lucy's ghost stalking the remains of the house until to tell its new owner a tragic story. So, a lot of these great tales often come from parish registers and things like that. I mentioned the Civil War blight. The Civil War caused turmoil throughout the land, and entries in parish registers often cease. So this makes it quite difficult to trace family history through it. Though some registers were kept up. This is Slimbridge and Bourton on the Hill here. And so some vicars did keep them up. Others didn't. And in 1653, births, marriages and deaths were made a civil matter to be recorded in secular parish registers by parish registrars and not by vicars. But sometimes the old church registers continue to be used, so entries appear without a break. But in other cases, the registers cease to be updated and new ones were purchased and actually used. Not many of these survive. We know that at the Restoration in 1660, the old system was restored, so most importantly, all civil marriages since 1642 were legitimised by the church, so that children were not classed as illegitimate. And that was primarily to sort of help out the royalists rather than the parliamentarians. The bishop's transcripts, so these are copies of the entries in the parish register and were made by the church warden or the minister. They were sent to the diocesan registry in Gloucester, and so are part of the diocesan records, our GDR collections. Some churches began making transcripts as early as 1562, but they were not officially required until 1597. And so at first it was the church warden who signed the copies, and or the minister, but later on it was the minister alone was responsible. They decided the church wardens weren't reliable enough, so the minister was. They can be easier to read, or they can be more difficult to read because they are in a different hand. But they also because they were kept in year order, but sadly not all years survive for every parish. So there's a sort of 6, 1.5 dozen of the other here. So they can sometimes be really useful, really easy to read. So if you've got a word in a parish register you can't read, sometimes the BTs, the Bishop Transcript, will explain it and you'll spot it. Others not so. The other problem is they're often made on scraps of parchment rather than full sheets. So sometimes the writing gets really cramped. So, sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad. And once civil registration of births, marriages and deaths started in 1837, these transcripts became less important and most parishes stopped keeping them. Interestingly, the last parish in Gloucestershire to keep them was North Cerney, which actually didn't stop sending these returns in until 1929. So that's well into the age of civil registration. So since the BTs were stored separately to the parish registers, they can survive when the original register has been lost and damaged. And the best example of we have here is the first parish register of Newland in the Forest of Dean, where the upper part of the volume's parchment pages have been completely eaten away by rats in the church. Now, I don't know, to a rat, parchment is pretty much like a packet of crisps, isn't it? And the iron gall ink used is probably a bit like soy sauce. So from a rat's point of view, this is a feast. And as you can say, the rats certainly did enjoy munching this parish register. Looking at wills, so the early history of wills is quite complex, but from the mid-1500s, a will enabled a person who was the testator, if a man, and a testatrix, if a woman, to specify how they wanted their property and possessions to be divided up after their death. Gloucestershire wills were approved by the Diocese of Gloucester, and they're all on ancestry, but for some unfathomable reason, and we don't know why, as you can see here, they imaged the microfiche copies of wills, not the originals. Now, the microfiche copies were tricky to read at the best of times, even if the language was good and in English. And to be honest, the actual images of ancestry are diabolical, so they're really hard to read, but they are there. So we do say, if you're looking for a will, find it on ancestry. If you really can't read it, we can order up the originals for you, but we don't do this as a matter of course. It's got to be a really, really hard one to read. So wills are often written on the testator's deathbed. They can include information about close family, the spouse, children and grandchildren, as well as wider family, friends, neighbours and servants. And they normally start with a classic preamble. It's in the name of God, I in the name of God, amen. Something along the lines of I, testator's name, being of sound mind but weak in body, do hereby divide, yada, yada, yada. There's little punctuation in them, so reading them can be tricky, especially as some can be highly complicated and involve marriages and all sorts of things. Others are more straightforward, but they are quite a nice resource to look at and to use, and you can find a lot of background information on people. They usually cover one page, but say complex wills can be several pages long. This is just an example. This is the will of Robert Raikes of Gloucester. It was made in 1755, proved 2 years later, and it's about sort of 3 foot by 2 foot. But then, as you can see in the middle here, is a square with extra writing on it. So wills, sometimes they could be so complex they took a long time to sort out. Some, though, have a wealth of detail. This little will, it's only about sort of 5 inches long by 3 inches deep. It's the will of Petronella of Lydney, who lived in Gloucester, and she died in 1368. And the will is really complex. It lists, all in Latin, gifts of money to priests, to clerks, the Gloucester Friaries, St Bartholomew's Hospital, as well as to friends, who she also left personal effects such as furred gowns, a mazer, chest cloaks and amber beads. It's a wonderful will. We do have a full transcript of it. She was a very wealthy woman, and amounts bequeathed vary from twopence, which is about £4 today, to 20 shillings, about 500. And her total wealth is around £7, which is about 3,400. So quite a vast sum of money she had. You do get letters of administration. So this is if a person died intestate without leaving a will, then their estate went to probate, where the Diocese of Gloucester Court decided who was entitled to any inheritance. The process used a pro forma form, but they do contain relatively little useful information. So if you're unfortunate enough to have these, they're not always of much interest or much use. The other thing is, if a person owned land and property in more than one diocese, there's a good chance that the will will be proved not by the local diocese, but by the Prerogative Court of Canterbury or the Prerogative Court of York if they're living up in the north. The Court of Canterbury covered the sort of the south of England and Wales, while York covered York, Durham, Northumberland, Westmoreland, Cumberland, Cheshire, and also Nottinghamshire, plus the Isle of Man. They are available to look at and purchase from the National Archives. So again, if you can't find a will, it's always worth having a look at the PCC wills as they're known. With some wills, though, it's that you can get a real feeling for the love and warmth that some folks had for their family and friends. And this is the will of Sarah Overbury, and records just such a lovely relationship. I gave to Hester Pusey the sum of £5, to her daughter Susanna Pusey the sum of £5 to keep the little bitch busy. Isn't that great? I actually love this one. And you're thinking this is going to hit this woman from beyond the grave, basically. It's excellent. We don't have too many of these, or I've not seen too many, but this one is wonderful. It's good, and thanks to Liz Jack for finding this before me many years ago. So after 1858, wills were approved centrally by the probate registry, a government body. We still have the probate registry in Gloucester. It's a lovely building on the corner of Pitt Street there. And these wills are contained in large volumes, and they are written in the most monotonous hand known to man. As an example of one there, these books are they are generally about sort of 6 to 8 inches thick. They are really heavy, and we don't get them out very often because they're starting, the leather covers are certainly starting to go. But if you look there at the writing, it's just got no fun in it whatsoever. And some of these wills go on for 5 and 6 pages, and they're really hard to understand, even though the writing is quite clear to see, but it's just the sheer size of them. Much more interesting are the inventories. So from 1530 to 1782, every executor of a will had to appoint 3 or 4 local men to appraise or value the deceased person's personal estate and provide the probate court with a full inventory or list of goods and land value in there, etc. These are much more fun. They basically start with wearing your wearing apparel and money and purse. Then they go on to list household items, large and small. After 1782, sadly, they were not legal requirements, though you could actually request one, which means that fewer inventories survive for the later period, which is a shame because they are wonderful things. They're typically arranged room by room, and this is an example, 1877 inventory, so it's quite a late one, by Thomas Dance of Twinging. It's quite a long inventory, it goes over about 3 or 4 pages, and this section lists the contents of the following rooms. The brew house, which included a copper, a mash tub, 2 skeels, which are wooden pails, and a hair-bottom sieve, among other things. They also got the chamber over the entry, which the chamber over the hall has a bureau, an oak chest, an oak table, and a bedstead, mat and hangings. It's got the passage chamber, which had a half-headed bedstead and feather bed in it. It also had the parlour chamber, which had a sacking-bottom bedstead, bolster pillows, quilts, a walnut tree chest of drawers, chinaware, cutlery, and linen, spelled with 2 N's alike. And also had the chamber over the drink house, which had old vessels and 40 old bags, presumably cloth ones or sacking ones, but it doesn't specify. So the inventories, they're marvellous tools. They can give a real lot of information about the testator's lifestyle, and so provide this real flesh on the bones. This is in 1730 inventory for Anne Randall. It's typical of what you can find on inventories if you're lucky. This one's got, I just picked up a few things, 2 bedsteads, 1 feather bed, 1 bolster, 2 blankets, 1 rug, a bed mat, cord curtains, and a valise or valance to 1 bed. four pairs and a half of sheets, 3 napkins, 7 pillowcases, 2 tablecloths, and some other linen. 1 split, 2 brass bandle splits, 1 tin candlestick, 1 flesh fork, and a pair of tongs. 1 little table board, 2 boxes, 3 coffers, and 1 side cupboard. And what's great about these is they can include things which are unrecognisable to us today. But that's half the fun, finding out what they are. And there are lots of resources on the internet as well as some books which go through items for inventories, and they are really fun to read. So inventories of farms and the like, or farmers, often list animals and agricultural equipment. This is back to the 1877 inventory of Thomas Dance. We looked at it earlier. This is living stock. It included 5 cows, 2 yearlings and 3 calves, 3 horses, 6 3-year-old colts, 2 2-year-old colts and 2 yearling colts, 67 sheep, 2 hay ricks and 2 middle stacks, 71 bags of old wheat, 100 bags of new wheat, 8 bags of beans, 3 pigs, more sheep, obviously they couldn't be bothered to count the rest of them, and 2 sets of saddle stones. And that's before we get onto in the stable there, you can see, and in the cart house and court. So, you look at this inventory, it'll give you almost an A to Z of this man's living. It's wonderful things. We look at settlement examinations. So if a parishioner fell on hard times, and they could look to the parish overseers of the poor for help, but really only if they were entitled to it. So to obtain relief, people had to be officially settled in the parish, while newcomers had to meet certain conditions. Typically had to be resident in the parish for 40 days without a complaint being made against them, or they could be employed in the parish for a year and a day. And if they were unable to meet these conditions, they would face what they called a settlement examination. And this is an example for Mary Stevens, who is described as a female bastard child aged about 13. Now, these examinations are carried out by 2 JPs, and they sought to determine a person's residence so they could not always contain a useful amount of biographical information. Some are excellent, some are less so. Some could be quite complicated. This is an interesting one. You see, it's a partly pro forma form. It's an examination of Charlotte Mustow. She's aged 69. She'd been born in Norton in the Cotswolds, but lived in Guyting Power, was with her husband for 45 years. When he became too old to work, the couple claimed poor relief from the parish, and after her husband died, she continued to claim relief there. But 16 years afterwards, she moved to Worcestershire to live with her daughter for 3 or 4 years. Then she moved to Horling. So having here, the relieving officer obviously took pity on her due to her age and poor health. But after 5 years, the Horling overseers had her examined, and the JPs decided that Guyting, not Horling, was a legal place of settlement. So she was removed there. Quite an upheaval at an old age. But you could say maybe she was going back to old friends. So after a settlement examination had taken place, the person was either judged to be legally settled in the parish or not. If they weren't, then they would be moved from the parish and sent to the parish that the JPs had determined was their last place of legal settlement. So this gives you 2 types of removal order. Orders to remove people from a parish and orders to remove people to the parish. Most of these, especially the later ones, are written on pro forma forms, and there's just an example here for you. A lot of these are actually in the search room as hard copies to look at, so we don't often get the originals out. They were not necessarily just for single people, could be for whole families, could be removed if required. This is one from Guyting Power for the removal from Guyting to the parish of Broadwell for the entire Parker family. It consisted of Thomas Parker, his wife Lydia, and their 3 children. So the whole families could be moved. This one particularly was signed on the 22nd of December 1846. It's not the best Christmas present for the family, having to up stakes and be moved from Guyting to Broadwell. So they could also remove single parents. So this is removal of Elizabeth Boucher and her son Charles from the parish of King Stanley to the parish of Cam. She and her husband had moved to the King Stanley some years earlier, but then the husband had deserted her, and without any means of support, she'd had to go to the parish overseers for help. After an examination, she was ordered to be removed from King Stanley and sent to Cam, which became a legal place of settlement. Although, interestingly, by this date, this means she went straight into Dursley Workhouse. Manorial records, so a manor's a large estate, usually dated from medieval times, which was owned or held by the lord of the manor. He would collect rents from tenants, hold manorial courts, primarily to preserve his rights, his tenant rights, and to regulate the running of the manor in a lawful fashion. So you get these two types of court. You get the court baron and the court leet. So courts baron basically dealt with maintenance of property, changes of tenancy, and other estate matters, while court leets dealt with minor breaches of the peace and public order, including breaches done for maintenance orders on the property, things like that. So both can have useful amounts of information from history, at the very least good lists of names, as you can see here. You have to be aware a little bit though, for they're often written in highly abbreviated Latin prior to 1733, but the sort of ones that are in English can be quite good to read. You can usually, if it's in Latin, pick up names and things, so it can be, they're not too bad. Census, so everybody knows the census. They are perhaps the most useful resources for family history. The first official census took place 10th of March in 1801, with information being collected by the overseers of the poor for the parish, aided by parish constables and other officers of the peace. This is a copy of the 1881 census for Ashworth. It was recorded in the parish, registered by the vicar. And you see it there, it's basically, this is at March the 10th, and a numbering of the inhabitants of the parish taken by order of the government. The numbers were as follows: inhabited houses 80, families 88, uninhabited houses 5, total males 237, total females 239, together 476 inhabitants. Out of these, 421 were employed in the business of agriculture and 55 in trade. So, that's not a great deal of information in terms of you've got no names or anything, but the other census did improve on this. So since 1981, there's been a census entry every 10 years, except in 1941 due to World War II. And the information recorded has increased over time. So in 1841 census, which is often classed as the first useful census, all you got was name, surname, age, sex, occupation, and whether they were born in the county where they were counted or elsewhere. You didn't know where the county was if they weren't born there. It's just yes or no. But look at the 1901 census: name of street, house number or name, whether or not the person was inhabited, the number of rooms occupied, if less than 5, name of each person that spent the night in the household, relationship of persons to the head of the family, each person's marital status, age at last birthday, sex, each person's occupation, whether employer or employee or neither, person's place of birth, and whether they were deaf, dumb, blind or lunatic. And obviously that's the words of the time. So of course the later censuses provide much more information, and they can be really, really useful. One of the best ways is it's because the census can enable you to identify title deeds to property. And we don't know, title deeds, documents used to prove ownership of property, a piece of land, include conveyances, mortgage, indentures. So when a property was sold, the old deeds were passed to the new owner. If the property was mortgaged, the mortgage provider would hold on to the deeds until the mortgage was paid off. And obviously this still happens today. However, from 1925, the owner only had to keep deeds showing the ownership of the last 30 years. In 1970, this decreased to 15 years. The sad result of this is that many older deeds were destroyed as they weren't needed. And there certainly was a wave of will deeds being skipped in the early 1970s, sadly. So sometimes you can be great and you can trace a deed right back with names of people, the occupiers. Other times you can't, sadly. So a typical deed, they're written in legalese. Don't forget, solicitors and clerks are paid by the word, and they are large. This is just a typical example I happen to have on my computer. It's written in indelible iron gall ink on parchment, which is cured animal skin. It's roughly 2.5 foot wide and 1.5 foot tall. It has a chirograph at the top. This is the wavy or spiky edge, and this is a way of proving authenticity. For the deed was drawn up twice, on one sheet of parchment, and then it was cut in half with this wavy line. So if there was any dispute in the future about what the deed said, two parties could bring it together, and if they matched with that line, it was deemed authentic. Large bundle deeds can be quite unwieldy. To be quite honest, they can be crunchy because the old parchment can be difficult to unfold once it's been kept in a bent state, as you can see here. So we can sometimes, we can always recover them, and we can always unfold them. It takes a long time. So on occasion, we might say, well, sorry, we'll have to put this to our conservation department while they gently unfold it and flatten it. The other thing with the deeds, obviously, is they're, again, written with little punctuation. Normally, where you get a bold word, that indicates the start of a paragraph. But with these things, if you approach these slowly and steadily and you get your eye in, they're not too bad to read. Some early deeds of large seals attached. This is an 1190 deed, pertains to a grant of land from a lady called Sibylla, the daughter of William the Girdler, to her niece Alice. And like all these early deeds, the land is described between two other pieces of land. So it lay between the land of Arnold Dunning and William the Girdler. And the land had been given to Sibylla by Helius, the Dean of St. Peter's Abbey, for a service. So they can be quite complicated to try and sort out. And this deed example is only literally about sort of 3 inches long by 1.5 inches deep. So the seal is about 2 inches in diameter. So you can see some get very, very small, especially the earlier ones. We think simply because parchment was quite expensive. Quick look at the workhouses. So between 1597 and 1834, each parish had to look after their own poor, either in their own homes, which was known as out relief, the parish workhouse, which was known as in relief, or in almshouses, and these were funded by parish charities. And often these parish workhouses still exist, and here's some here, Frampton Cottrell from Geograph, and below it is the old almshouses on London Road in Gloucester. By the early 1830s, it was clear that this system was quite expensive and very inefficient. So in 1834, the Poor Law Unions were created. There are 21 in Gloucestershire, and their idea was they worked by grouping together parishes to make managing and funding the poor much more efficient and less costly. So these unions worked on a system of no out relief initially, and assistance was only given in union workhouses, and these were run on a no work, no help policy with segregation, less support for illegitimate mothers, where we heard that before, quite recently, thank you, what's her name, Priti Patel, and also standard treatment across the whole board. So they were much, much harsher places. Under these laws, each union had to build a specific workhouse if they did not have a suitable one. And this actually triggered a mini construction boom because the new union workhouses were all built like prisons, essentially. And this was deliberate because the intention of the new system was to make being in a workhouse much worse than being outside. So only the very desperate would actually help to ask and have to go into them. And this is a thing that's retained even up into the 1920s, where grandparents might say, oh, they went into the workhouse, it was terrible, so people were ashamed of having to go into the workhouses. But you can see this is a typical example of one, and very often they have this sort of cross shape. So for family historians, poor law unions usually keep good records. Typically you get the Boards of Guardians minute books. Now these have survived for virtually every union in Gloucestershire, and they record things up to the late 1920s. They often record things in good detail. And this can include whether to take in families or not, special dietaries, pursuit of absent fathers, apprenticing of sort of younger people, inmates' work expenses, and lots of other details. You can also get registers of admission and discharge to the workhouse, and these can basically include personal details of individual inmates. Sadly, survival rates of these records vary, so some do, some don't. And also you can get registers of births and deaths and baptisms in the workhouses, and they generally kept registers of these, and they contain more information than just official certificates. But again, sadly, not all of these have survived. So if you happen to have any villains in your past, in your family, count your blessings, because it usually means you can find much more information than those of you with law-abiding ancestors. You've got a vast amount of records. You've got things as jail registers, transportation bombs, court records, newspaper reports about crimes committed. There can be a wealth of information. If you're doubly lucky, you may also find photographs of prisoners, so some of the registers do have them. Now, most of these criminal records are contained within the county and borough quarter sessions, which, again, they're good catalogues of these we have. They're well listed. And this is just a couple of pictures of images of various villains and rogues that I picked up from a jail register we had out the other day. It has to be said, we don't normally get these out, primarily because in the past we've caught people trying to cut images out, so we don't generally get them out. Or if we do, we will give you them as one-to-one supervision. It's no sort of shaming on yourself. It's the way we've decided to do it. So a real bonus for family historians is that these jail registers generally contain a physical description of the prisoner, which is a real meet the ancestors moment. So this is an example. This is the main county jail. It registers, it records height, hair, eyes, visage, complexion, other marks. This is some of the descriptions. I'm not sure you'd want to be related to these guys. Very stout, scar left brow and left chin, a fractured nose, scar left eyebrow, curly hair, has had fracture of nose, scar centre of forehead, another one, scar left cheekbones and left calf, ring on second left finger. So these particular ones must have been rather, how should we say it, I don't know how to say it, sort of slightly suspicious characters, people you wouldn't want to meet down a dark alley. But generally these registers are really good, and you can find lots of information in them. They also record whether prisoners could read or write, usually with IMP or imp for imperfect and R for reading. Where neither is put there, we think that implies a prisoner could read and write to a reasonable standard. But again, the registers also recorded prisoner's occupation, which is a really useful pieces of information for family historians. So in this, just one example I pulled out, we've got a wood vendor, a labourer, a hatter, a hatter's wife, and a waterman. So you can get a good idea of what your ancestor was doing as well. Looking at maps, we've got 24,698 documents with the word map in our online catalogue. That's quite a lot. The main point to remember about maps is that they were drawn for a specific purpose, usually to show land ownership, but other reasons did exist. This is the early example of the earliest recognisable map we hold, dates from 1574. It shows Lydney Marsh in the middle. It's a diagrammatic map, and it's marked up, shows strips of land around the marsh, each with the names of the person who occupied them. Presumably occupied them for agricultural purposes. You couldn't build down here. So, don't always expect maps to be quite easy to look at. Sometimes they can be quite difficult and don't bear any relation to what we think of a map should be today. Here's an example. This is the earliest map we hold, the 1455 roll of Langaville Rents in Gloucester. Arguably it's more of a survey than a map, but it is laid out as if you're walking along the Gloucester's Gate Street, so that makes it relatively easy to understand, especially when you realise, you can see here, the altar through the high cross crops up on several pages, and you suddenly realise what it means. It's really good information. It gives the names of owners, of occupants in each side of the tenements on both sides of the street. So this is really useful if you've got ancestors in Gloucester around 1455. It can be very helpful. It's written in Church Latin, so this isn't the easiest document to read, but luckily there was a transcription into English. And this is a page in this transcription and the same page from the actual document itself. And you can see on the day we've got lots of names. So John Girdler. Now, interesting, Girdler was a belt maker, but here he's actually given as a barber. So John Girdler, John Brazier, Sibella Savage, Peter Prositovan, John Northwich, Thomas of Barnwood, Margaret of Barnwood, John Taverner, Morris Cutler, Roger, and there's numerous more names in there. So again, if you've got relatives in Gloucester 1455, this is a cracking document for you to have a look at. So enclosure map. So the enclosure changed landscape forever, creating a patchwork of hedgerows and fields that we know and love today. It also set out roads, footpaths and rights of way, many of which still survive. So early enclosure was undertaken by informal agreements, but by the end of the 1700s, there was private or public act of parliament. Basically, this made it much easier to overrule local opposition, as the changes always favoured the better off, while the poor lost many of their common law rights and lots of their land. So the enclosure records usually comprise a map and an apportionment, and together they record details of owners and tenants of the land with numbers on the map corresponding to an entry in the apportionment. They are typically the earliest maps available for any individual parish, and this is a map drawn up for Wollaston. It's one of about 18 maps for Wollaston. And it shows the village here. Okay, you can just probably make out some numbers and names. It's got the table of reference on the right-hand side, which gives the names of the villages and the land they were allotted. It's actually good for locating people in specific dwellings, but sadly not every parish has one of these maps. We certainly used this map about 15 years ago now, with Wollaston School, and we were actually able to walk around the village, and some of the houses that were there then were still there today, and that some of the children lived in them, and they found this really fascinating. So tithe maps, these are usually the second map you could look at. They were created after the Tithe Commutation Act of 1838, and most date from the late 1830s to the early 1840s. The whole system was introduced to rationalise payment of tithes to the church, primarily to defer from payments of produce to payments of money. So henceforth, the vicar didn't get 3 chickens, half 3 eggs, half a chicken, and a piece of corn. He got like 2 shillings and 6pence or something. So the tithe maps show buildings, tracks, roads, fields, woods. Each plot is numbered, and details of the landowners and tenants for each plot is contained in the apportionment. The apportionment usually has field names, which can be a fascinating thing to look at. So you'll get to know old field names. And the apportionments also show what category the plot was. So was it a house? Was it a building? Was it a garden? Was it arable land? Was it pasture, etc.? So again, these could be really, really useful research tools. And a quick way to access the enclosure and tithe maps to the county is via Know Your Place, which is the free comparative mapping site. It does have a drawback. Mainly, it doesn't give you the name reference number of the map you're looking at, or does it on this? It doesn't give you that or the enclosure or tithe apportionments. You can't get those, but it's enough for a good starter. And if you find somewhere on a tithe map, you can always look at our apportionments, which are online at that address. And because that's you can search our website put tithe search and it'll come up. If you're looking on enclosure maps, you can come into the archives and look at the enclosure map database on a dedicated double monitor computer. So there are ways around this. We don't generally get the original ones of these out, partly because they are so big, some can be really unwieldy, but partly because they are not in brilliant condition, a lot of them, so we don't get them out to preserve them for the future. The 1910 Finance Act, also known as the Lloyd George Survey of Land Values or the Domesday Book of Maps, these records are compiled as part of the Finance Act in 1909, which brought in a new tax based on the value of property. The maps themselves are based on the second edition of 1902 Ordnance Survey, and they're accompanied by books of reference where they survive. So they're really interesting, lots of good information. They give you details of landowners, tenants, land use and its value. Now, both the maps and books of reference where they survive can be found on the Bristol and Gloucestershire Archaeological Society's project website, www.glos1909 survey. So if you want to look at this, the easiest way of doing it is put Lloyd George Survey Gloucestershire and it'll take you to the site. It's very useful, lots of great information on it. So, estate surveys, landed estates, typically both large and small, kept records of their administration. So for family history purposes, estate records can be very useful, as they may hold rent records, deeds, leases, wage records, things like that. And private landowners became more common after the Reformation, and most began to keep records of what they were doing with their land, like who they were leasing it to and how they were making money from it. And the bulk of the estate records tend to date from the 1700s, 1800s, when the manorial system began to decline and private landowners became more prominent. But, depending on the estate, there can be much earlier records. And again, you might be lucky with some, you might be unlucky, but it's always worth looking at them. This is an example. This is an estate, a land of reference. Oh, sorry, I clicked the wrong one there. Shows lands and property in Thornbury belonging to Sir Richard Newman, Baronet of Fivehead, Magdalen in Dorset. So he owned most of Thornbury. Beautifully drawn. It's got a table referencing field numbers there. You can see it. It's quite a nice map to look at. This is when we get out, but also what I like about it, if you look in the top left there, you can see the city of Bristol drawn as a little square, essentially. So again, map makers drew what they wanted to show and what they've been told to show. The land tax, this can be another source. It was payable for all property and had land which had a yearly value of more than 20 shillings. It was introduced to replace the hearth tax from 1693 and went on to 1963, so quite late. Surviving records are part of the quarter sessions. They're arranged by hundred, which is an ancient grouping of parishes, then subdivided by parish. Returns survive for the years 1730 and 1832, and they contain the land of the landowner, and from 1781 the occupier of the property. They don't have a massive amount of records, but they can be quite interesting. Some returns and other records related to the land tax, particularly after 1832, can be found in parish collections, estate collections, or in local studies collections. So it's a bit of a scattering, really. But they're not going to give you a huge amount, but you never know. It might be that one name you're missing or that one date you're missing. Trade and street directories, useful for family history. They survived from the late 1700s, although the late 1700s were very scanty, and they cover the whole of the county, usually as time passes, with individual volumes for Gloucester, Cheltenham, some of the market towns. This is an example. This is the entries in the county directory for Lower Slaughter for 1910 and 1927, respectively. Each entry usually has a list of residents. And these are primarily listed as private residents, i.e. the great and the good, and the more important commercial ones. So they don't list anybody. And we don't really know yet how the commercial people went into these. We don't know if they paid or if they didn't. That's out to pasture, out to thought, really. Past 1850, they're much more numerous and much more comprehensive. And certainly past 1900, they're very, very useful things. They have a lot of information in them. This is the typical one. They're mostly split between A to Z gazetteer of places and then an A to Z gazetteer of trades and professional directory, which can be very interesting, especially look at the old occupations. So again, really interesting things to look at. Looking at electoral registers and poll books, so poll books from 1763, the electoral registers from 1832 include the names of those entitled to vote. They cover the whole county, but do not include obviously every person over 21 years old until 1928. Prior to this, there were various restrictions on those who were enfranchised to vote, typically dependent on property values and sex. This is a typical page from an older electoral register. This is for Barton St Mary in Gloucester for 1893. It shows one of the issues of these electoral books because this is arranged by street in Pollen district. Therefore, searching for surnames is quite difficult. They generally contain just the name and the qualification of the abode and nothing else. So, they're good for getting an idea, but they can be really, really hard to search. This is a typical page for a modern electoral register. In this sense, is for a page for Arlingham in Stroud, 1974. By this date, their surnames are arranged alphabetically in the Pollen district. This makes searching parishes and villages quite easy because they're not too big, but searching large towns and cities is very awkward because you still need to know the electoral district of the person you're looking for. All these are available on Ancestry. This is one occasion where their name search facility can actually help quite well. Look at rotten boroughs. We haven't really got any rotten boroughs here, but this is an example. This is the poll book for Berkeley 100 in 1833. Here, the person in the left-hand column got a vote, as they were basically the landowner, but so did the tenant in the right-hand column. And we're told, we believe that if the left-hand person had more than one qualifying property, they got more than one vote. So again, this is an idea of how things have sort of improved, and how big landowners got lots more votes than other people. Quick look at licensing. So officialdom, it can be a pain in the neck, but it can be a very handy resource. And where individuals had to interact with any kind of officialdom, it usually generated some kind of record. This is just 3 examples among the many we have. So on the left-hand side is a license for a gamekeeper. So this gives you the name of the gamekeeper, the name of the person who's employing him. In the centre, you've got a certificate for a privileged engine, which is a fish weir. And again, it's got the owner of the weir there. So again, more information. And on the right hand side here, this is an application to become a Cheltenham fly driver. It's a type of horse-drawn hansom cab, basically. It's got the name of the person applying, and it's got names of people who approved it. So again, lots of names, quite handy. The main problem with these is that they are scattered throughout the archives and other collections. They're not arranged by personal names at all. So, if you think you had an ancestor who was like a fly cab driver, you're going to have to look through the records of the Cheltenham licensing in this instance. If you think you had somebody who had a fish weir on the river, you've got to look through the collection for this. So it can be quite hard to find them, but this is what family history is all about. It's doing the hard yards to get to the good stuff. Newspapers, again, these can be really useful. They record events, news stories, birth, marriages and deaths, court records, personal adverts and much more. So, looking through these, if you've got know a person on a right date, they did something or they might be in the paper, always worth having a look through, especially the sales. They're brilliant. They can be really handy. And photographs, because these can be unsurpassed family history sources, but only a photographer records the date, subject and place, which sadly they didn't always, and we don't even do it today. Although modern cameras, phone cameras, generally record a date and location, there are actually far fewer photographs being printed today. So I suspect that the use of photographs in family history is going to be a diminishing resource. And historians of the future are going to no doubt curse the arrival of our mad love of the digital image. We're going to keep them on our phones, and what happens when we die? They're going to be up there in a cloud connect system. So, for really good family history stuff, it's always worth printing out a photo, dating it, who's there, the who, why, what, how sort of thing of it. And that brings us to the end of the talk today. So happy to take some questions if you've got some. Our next event at the Heritage Hub is the Gloucestershire Family History Society's Family History Fair on the 2nd of November, Saturday 2nd of November from 10 onwards. It's got talks by Nick Barrett, who needs no introduction. He's a fantastic speaker, great knowledge of family history. And it's also got a talk by Joanna Teague, local textile historian, about stitching lives together, celebrating Gloucester's dressmakers, tailors and pin makers. As always, we're going to have a great display of family history related documents, free refreshments, and the Gloucestershire Family History Society will of course be on hand to help find the root and branch of your family. And my last, as always, I'll get a little plug for the next Secrets Revealed talk, which is the Gloucestershire Cuts, Canals in Gloucestershire, on the 27th of November, and we'll be looking at the history of our county's wonderful canals. And on that note, I'll hand back to you, Bryony.
Thank you, John. That was fascinating and insightful as always. There is one question in the chat at the moment. So from Emma Neve, I've never come across an old license for a marriage like the one John has shown. Where would these be found?
So there are several types of license. So we generally lump together as GDR. I know the numbers Q1s, Q2s, and Q3s. So I think, if I remember right, the Q2s are ones where the people came in to speak to the surrogate, and they're listed in volumes. And the other ones, the Q3s, are where people are basically, the surrogate is touring around the county and he just takes names and details. So if you look on our online catalogue, look for one of the names of the people you're looking for, you should get the reference to it. It'll be something like GDR stroke Q3 165 or 1765, something like that. But yeah, have a look on there. If it doesn't work, drop us an email, archives@gloucestershire.gov.uk, and we can have a look for you to make sure you're not missing anything.
That's great, thank you. There's another question of, if you've hit a dead end, with research on a family member, is there somebody you can ask for help?
Yes, I would also say we know a lot of stuff here in the archives. We're not the experts on family history, so best thing to do is go to the Gloucester Family History Society. They're co-located on site to us, and if there isn't somebody in the GFHS who hasn't come across the problem and solved it, it's never going to be solved. They are really, really knowledgeable. They are offer to help so much. They offer help for free, and I would say if you're doing your family history, I'd always say join them. I think they're about 10 quid a year, and it gives you access to the resource centre and all the combined knowledge that all the people in that centre and also in the society have. So that's the best thing I'd say. Go and join the Family History Society, or come in and have a chat to them, and I'm sure they'll be able to help you.
I would definitely agree with that. They are fantastic. Another quick question: how would someone become a master confectioner?
I would suspect they would have to serve an apprenticeship. Now, we do have some apprenticeship records. I've not actually seen any for the Guild of Master Confectioners, so maybe I suspect they might be a London-based organisation. So you might need to have a look at the London Metropolitan Archives, because I would suspect somebody had to serve an apprenticeship. Then they would have to go to the Guild of Master Confectioners and prove what they could do, and then they would be admitted into the guild. So I would imagine that's probably the best thing. There is probably a website somewhere for the Guild of Master Confectioners. They probably still exist today. So have a look down that route. And again, I suspect the Family History Society might be able to help with that as well.
That's great. Thanks, John. There aren't currently any other questions, but if there is anything else that anyone would like to know, please do send us an email and we will get back to you. Thank you again for coming, and thank you, John, for presenting to us today.
No problem. Thank you very much. So cheerio, everybody. See you next month. Goodbye.